For the last 2 years, most of the AI conversations have centered on models, GPUs, and infrastructure. More recently, we've switched towards agents. But I think we're starting to discover that neither models nor agents are the biggest challenge. The real challenge is context. Enterprise data is fragmented across structured and unstructured systems. Business definitions live in documents and people's heads, and every AI application seems to be building on its own understanding of the business. The result is inconsistent answers, unnecessary token consumption, governance challenges, and AI systems that are often technically impressive, but not consistently trustworthy. That raises an interesting question for enterprise architects. Is context simply another metadata problem, or is it becoming a foundational layer of AI, a shared service that gives every agent, every model, and every application a common understanding of the business? To explore this more and where we're heading, I'm really excited to be joined by Swaroop Jagadish, who's the co-founder and CEO of DataHub. Welcome in.
Great to be here, Rob. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to talk about this. Obviously, it's front and center of all conversations, but it's also a very noisy space. So I'm happy to dig in and clarify.
Definitely a noisy space, to put it mildly. I think, again, we don't go kind of a day without talking about context and people looking at trustworthiness of AI. I mean, it's all over the place. But in our last conversation we had when you guys were briefing me, really DataHub was described as a trusted context layer sitting between enterprise data and AI agents. If that's true, are we actually watching the emergence of a new enterprise control plane? What capabilities have to exist before we can legitimately say context has become infrastructure rather than simply another metadata service?
Yep, great question. So when you think about a standard metadata platform, you're typically talking about the technical graph, right? What are the schemas, the lineage, operational metadata, and it's important. It's really important, and you can still take programmatic action on top of that. But really, what's required on top of that is the semantic graph, which tells you what these concepts actually mean to the business and the actual understanding of domains and the human corrections on top of the agentic decisions that make use of all of this context. So it's a continuously curated and maintained context graph that combines the technical graph along with the semantic graph. So what turns it into an infrastructure is it has to be on the inference path, right? So it goes beyond just having a passive system that sits on the side. Agents need to query it at the moment they're actually acting on it. And that answer shapes the action, right? So it has to support the runtime SLAs. It needs to have latency in milliseconds. It needs to have the uptime commitments, the things that you would demand from an infrastructure layer, right? Third, it's also read-write. Agents don't just consume context. They also feed learnings back. And the layer that absorbs that gets richer with each use, right? So that's actually important. And this infrastructure layer has to be neutral across all platforms. A control plane owned by one warehouse vendor is a feature of that warehouse, but enterprises run multiple platforms. So the simple test is, if you unplug it, can the agents still keep working, or will they get worse over time? If you just have a metadata service, that's not enough, but you actually have an infrastructure where all of the business context and the technical context is continuously curated, that turns that into an infrastructure if it's in the inference path.
Yeah, we definitely talk about this. I think are we creating another set of islands of automation kind of scenario like we talked about in the early 2000s? But, to the other side of this, everyone claims they have context, but very few people define what good context actually looks like. If you were advising a CIO, what metrics should they be measuring? Accuracy, token reduction, agent success ratios, latency, business consistency. How do you know your context layer is actually improving enterprise AI?
Again, I think the enterprises are really struggling with this question right now. How do you know this is the right investment? To me, I think the North Star is agent task success rate on questions that actually touch enterprise data, right? That's the North Star. And it starts with a few foundational things that you need, like you need an eval system based on the tasks that the agents are actually doing. So if it's an analytics agent use case, for example, you actually need to build the questions that your business actually asks, a set of, let's say, 100 questions, and you have to have a way of measuring your task success rate. For example, your Q2 revenue by segment, which customers are at risk. So these are the types of questions where experts can come and certify the answers. And then you measure the pass rate with and without the context graph, right? So that delta is the value, and it's a number that a CIO will actually accept. But you also need diagnostic metrics, right? So you need things like, hey, was it the right context that was pulled? So retrieval precision, consistency is another thing that you want to see. If there are two agents, one in finance and one in marketing, they ask the same question. Are they actually getting results that are appropriate for their domain, or are the answers getting mixed up? And finally, cost, right? Everyone's talking about cost. The model layer is starting to get commoditized, not yet, but it is starting to get commoditized, which means that you don't need a Ferrari for all the tasks that you have. Like you want to save the best models for the highest value tasks. So you need a way to treat the context graph as a token cache, and you need to be able to prove that cost is actually materially lower when the context graph is used. So if a vendor cannot tell you how they improve task success rate, or how they improve costs, and how they reduce confusion, then I think it's more hype than real.
No, I love that. I think you're dead on with that. I think people are trying to figure it out, because I think putting in a budget for tokens is no CFO knows how the hell to do that. And I think it absolutely drives them nuts. And I know we've talked about that before. But, today most organizations have dozens of AI agents, copilots, semantic layers, catalogs, RAG systems that all create their own understanding of the business. Does every agent need to build its own memory, or do you envision a future where enterprises and enterprise context becomes reusable shared service that every model and every agent consumes, kind of, almost a PaaS layer for them?
Right. So I would split memory into two things, two distinct parts. One is episodic memory, and the other is institutional memory. Episodic memory is more like, hey, what happened in this session, this task, this user interaction? That belongs to the agent, and that's fine. It should stay local to the agent, because it's a way for that agent to introspect and get better with that, and so on. But the institutional memory, for example, what is the actual definition of an active customer? There's no reason for 50 agents to all figure that out independently, right? And it's worse if they all figure it out with slightly different understanding, right? That's when you get the semantic drift, and you end up with a different fragmentation problem. So it's really important that the institutional memory layer is treated more as an infrastructure layer. We've actually solved this problem before. We didn't let every application ship its own login system, right? There's no reason to have agents have their own institutional memory layer, right? The protocols like MCP and A2A, they all make it practical to actually build it. So I would definitely treat the institutional memory layer as more of an infrastructure component.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great, because I think that also kind of leads into my next question, which is, one thing that's stood out to me was your distinction between enforcing kind of that permissions, or where the context is coming from, either at the source systems, versus governing context centrally. As enterprises move towards hundreds or even thousands of AI agents, where should governance actually live? And is governance becoming a property of the context layer, rather than the application layer?
Yeah, I would split governance into three distinct activities, right? Because they land in different places. When you're thinking about data access governance, right? That enforcement should actually stay at the source systems, because I don't think you'll get good results if you take that out of the platforms that actually implement the access, right? So, for example, the warehouse enforces row and column level access policies. The last thing you want is a context layer to bypass that and pull the controls for how to access individual rows and columns. That principle doesn't change. However, the semantic policy governance, right? For example, if you're in a pharma company, an agent is trying to act on clinical trial data. What if the patients for the clinical trials have not given consent to this type of analysis that the agent wants to do? That is the type of a semantic policy that should be handled at the context platform layer, right? Because you're even trying to determine what is the purpose of usage of this data. Are you allowed to use it, right? I also think auditing should belong to the context platform layer, right? Where if you have a handful of agents, you can review each one of them and see what's going on. But if you have thousands, you need one place where you can definitively answer which agents touched patient clinical trial data last week and for what purpose, right? So that per application governance simply doesn't scale past a few agents if you don't have it at the context platform level, because it's semantic governance. So, so I would say, depending on what you're talking about, but most of the access policies, like at the physical level, will continue to stay where they are, but audit and semantic policy enforcement will actually move to the context platform.
Yeah, I agree. I think again, it's been an interesting set of weeks about people talking about where, at the root system, and then how do you propagate it up? But like you said, definition of customer, definition of revenue, different sources of truth, as it would be, and how do you, make sure that the agent is using the right definition in the right place? Definitely becomes, how do you govern that? And when you have thousands of agents, not just, a handful, that scope and that scale definitely changes the math on how you understand and govern through that, not to mention audit it for that, because if you can't audit it, you really can't govern it, to put it mildly. So, one of the things that we're also seeing is that today, you're using subject matter experts, or companies are using subject matter experts to continuously validate context. You kind of brought that up, certifying and stamping it, because business definitions evolve. I mean, and people understand how they work in their processes. But what happens when AI agents themselves begin to generate new metrics, documentation, workflows, and even business knowledge faster than humans can review it? Does context eventually become self-improving, or will human validation always remain a limiting factor or a needed factor for that matter?
Yeah, I think the basic premise that you're bringing up is right. Agents are already proposing critical data products, proposing metrics and doing a lot of the data engineering themselves, right? So humans keeping up with that pace of agentic data development is hard, right? But the answer isn't removing humans, it's changing what they validate. So first thing today, I think the humans are in the critical path, but actually they need to get more involved in interventions rather than quarterbacking the whole thing, right? So subject matter experts need to actually still understand the full provenance of how something was arrived at, right? So that we can actually implement automated cross checks. For example, a proposed revenue metric has to reconcile against the certified one before it becomes visible to other agents. Machines are good at consistency checking, so let them do a first pass, but then you need to have the kind of the tier trust levels, right? Humans stop reviewing individual facts and start certifying at the level of policy. What evidence is sufficient before agents can proceed? Which sources are authoritative? what gets auto-approved versus escalated to humans. So humans start defining the rules of the road in terms of when agents are free to proceed versus, okay, they need an intervention. So they will start getting engaged at that level. We actually have a parallel here. It's the same evolution as software. Engineers went from writing every line to reviewing every line to reviewing diffs at a more logical level, to defining CI rules, which determines what gets merged into production code. So code didn't get less trustworthy. Like, humans found a way to scale themselves, right? Because the checks became more and more systematic. So we're going to see similar advances here, where humans will start to define higher level principles for when an agent is free to go do its job versus, there has to be a gate where they have to get involved. Today, that gate is still evolving, but I think in a year from now, it'll be semantic gates. So context will largely become self-improving. Human validation will not disappear, but it will move up the stack, so that the bottleneck is not at the review throughput. It's more about trust calibration. And, obviously that's a much better problem to have for humans, and human brains will be utilized much better if that's the problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great place for us to leave it, because I think this has been very eye-opening. I think everybody has their own view, and organizations, like you said, are trying to wrap their heads around exactly how to deal with this problem. So I really appreciate you coming on board and kind of sharing with us, because you're in the middle of all of this context, to put it mildly. So thanks for coming on board.
Pleasure being here, Rob. Again, thanks for having me on. And I know a lot of people are grappling with these issues, so I'm happy to clarify a lot of the questions that you asked.
Yeah, and they can reach out to you. I know you guys have a great Slack community that's out there, and you have a number of other ways to get in touch with you guys. So it's fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Bye.
And thank you for watching this episode. We'll be back with more.